Everybody, as I said, please take your sandwiches out of the bag so that you can eat and it won't, the crinkling sound, you don't mind crinkling? Okay. So if everybody could get in their seats, okay. If everybody could make it to their seats, that would be great. I just had a conversation with Steve Bador, who is a state senator who's now retired, but who Marty Meehan referenced as the idea person for 5th District Day, who happens to be here in the back of the room, and he said that he actually proposed to his wife on a 5th District Day. So it's great. So it's great to have him here with us, even as we miss him, and he's no longer in elective office. But I just want to say I'm so pleased to welcome NinaTotenberg, who has strong 5th District ties. You probably didn't know this, but her husband is from Haverhill. And yeah, so that is absolutely great. Nina is NPR's award-winning legal affairs correspondent, and in fact, as I was driving in the district and I had on NPR, I was listening to Nina's commentary on the oral argument before the Supreme Court on the individual mandate in the Healthcare Reform Act. I said, oh, I think it would be great to invite Nina to come and speak on 5th District Day. And so it is wonderful to have her here, and I know much of it is prompted by the fact that she does have such ties to the 5th District. Her reports air regularly on NPR's critically acclaimed news magazines, All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and Weekend Edition. And her coverage of the Supreme Court in legal affairs has won her widespread recognition. Newsweek has said, quote, the mainstays of NPR are Morning Edition and All Things Considered, but the creme de la creme is NinaTotenberg. So it's wonderful to have her here. She's been very busy this year. I know we're all eager to hear her analysis of the high-profile cases the Supreme Court has been considering in recent months. Thank you so much, Nina, for taking time out of your busy day. And with that, NinaTotenberg.
Thank you, Congresswoman, very much. I'm delighted to be here, but rushed. I'm in the middle of the, and this seems somehow suitable, the Roger Clemens trial. I must say, I'm just sort of amazed at this jury. It's the best educated jury I've ever seen. There's 7 of them that have graduate degrees and nobody who knows a damn thing about baseball. In fact, the guy I was sitting next to today, who I sit next to most days because he knows he's there every day and I'm not. I go in and out, but he's from ESPN and he's in from Chicago to cover the trial. And as I walked in, I was late. There was an accident in the 3rd Street Tunnel and I was late and I said, and they were talking about the Grimsley something or other, and he said baseball, and I said, what Grimsley? He said baseball player. I said, Jason Grimsley? He said, very good. So I proved my bona fides in that way, I guess. So I really prepared nothing for today. Part of the reason I'm a little frantic, as some of you who are Boston Globe or New York Times readers may or may not know, my dad died last week. And he was a great virtuoso violinist who had a great life and a great death, with all of his students coming from all over the country in the last week to play at his bedside, and he was 101. But I had obituary duty. So the sisters, the Totenberg sisters, one of whom is a federal judge, one of whom has her own business in New York, and I'm the crappy reporter. They gave me, my assignment was obituaries. So I wrote one, dealt with all the papers, answered the questions, gave them people to call, and dealt with all the other things you deal with. So basically, I'm a week behind. That's what all this means. The bottom line here is I'm a week behind. There's a piece I'm supposed to do about the Commerce Clause. I am nowhere on it. And I sort of missed a week of Clemens as well. And so, anyway, you know, you all, I'm sure, because you're here, you're people who really do care about issues and what's going on in the country and in Massachusetts and in your district. And there probably is not much I can tell you about the Affordable Care Act oral argument or the prospects of how it's going to turn out that you haven't read in the newspaper. I don't know better than anybody else. I generally don't bet on Supreme Court outcomes because there are always surprises, but if I were forced to bet, I would probably bet that the court will strike down some or all of the ACA. And when that happens, it's going to land like a bomb in this place because much of the earlier parts of the bill, the structure, as you all know, have already been implemented, and I don't know how you sort of unravel that. If they were to only strike down the mandate and the rate setting, that would be one thing, but if they were to strike down the whole thing, I'm not quite sure how that will work. As I said, I didn't prepare anything, so I'm just going to have to rely on you to ask questions. Yeah.
Ms. Totenberg, my sympathies on the loss of the file.
Thank you.
On a lighter note, has anybody asked Roger Cummins for his autograph?
Yeah, they have at in the courthouse. They have, and he's given it freely. It's actually kind of interesting because there's really not much public interest in the trial. Usually, a big trial like this, there's a line of people waiting to get in, and you can't have more than one person from every news organization. There's plenty of room. You know, it's not a big courtroom. It's no bigger than this room. Probably smaller than, in fact, definitely smaller than this room. But in terms of the public seating, but there's enough room. Most days, there's enough room.
Nina, can you talk about how you became legal affairs correspondent? What the path was like?
My path to being dean of the Supreme Court Press Corps is a very inauspicious one. I think now I have 15 honorary degrees, but none of them are, I have no degree that's earned. I am, to put it bluntly, a college dropout. And my first job was for the old Record American, the Record, in Winthrop Square, in a building that had no air conditioning, and guys who wore green eye shades still, and pieces of carbon sort of that floated around from the press room. And then I went to work for the Peabody Times, where I did everything. I covered the police beat, the city council, everything. The courts. There was one day when every story on the front page was had my byline on it. I sat there just staring at it. I was very young and very pleased. And in about 1968, the presidential primaries came to New Hampshire next door, and I started driving up at night to cover them, and I freelanced the stories because God knows the Peabody Times didn't want to hear much about it. And I covered the first Romney and Eugene McCarthy, and had a great time, met a lot of people. And then I came to Washington and with a big folder of clippings and got myself a job. My first real job was for roll call. Was it roll call come first or something? Yeah, roll call came first, and it was a lot smaller than it is now. And I was the staff. And then I went to work for the late great National Observer, which was a weekly publication put out by Dow Jones. And it was a great place to work because, first of all, there were very good writers there, very good editors, and it was a weekly, so I had time to learn things. And I got assigned to cover the Supreme Court, among other things. Because it was a weekly, I had time to study, and I studied like mad. Lots and lots of things, and issues, and called anybody up. That's one thing about being 20-something. You're really totally fearless. And if you're ignorant, you don't mind admitting it. The trouble is when you get older, you mind admitting it. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, I was reading a brief, and I just couldn't understand something. So I looked at all the people who filed amicus briefs in the case, and found one who I knew really well. And I called him up, it was Walter Dellinger, and I said, Walter, I do not want you to tell anybody this, but would you look at pages, I don't know, 35 to 37 of the petitioner's merits brief? I said, because I really don't understand what they're saying. He said, sure. He looks at it, long pause. He says, I don't understand either. Made me feel a lot better. So in those days, though, I would just ask anybody and anything, and one of the people I called, there was a case called Reed versus Reed, which was the first case in which the Supreme Court laid down rules about sex discrimination and said that you couldn't discriminate based on gender. And the brief was written, it was filed by a Rutgers law professor, and I called her up. And because I really didn't, I thought, well, okay, the 14th Amendment applies to blacks. How does it apply to women? So I called up this professor, and then Professor Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave me an hour lecture. And I got to know her very well over the years as a result of that. So, I worked at the Observer for 5 years. Then I worked for a magazine that didn't last long, for about a year, and got recruited to work for NPR, where I've been ever since. I have on occasion had contracts with ABC or NBC for a year or 2 or 5 to do special projects for them, but actually not for quite a while. So I love working at NPR. I'm not allowed to fundraise for political candidates, but I can fundraise for NPR. So please, if you have a major contribution, if you have a major contribution, please do it now. Yes?
I would like to know, if you had to do it over again, what would you do differently? Or are you happy with the way your life is going? Or is there something that you would like to do? Oh, did I throw you a curveball?
No, I mean, I've been very fortunate. I came of age in a profession that, by and large, did not hire women at a time when they were just starting to hire women. And I have actually been very successful in certain regards because I was the first woman, or one of the only women of a certain age and a certain level of experience who was available. So I do this program called Inside Washington. Would they pick me today for that job? Probably not. But when they first picked me, there simply weren't a lot of women around who had a lot of experience covering a lot of things, including politics. So I've been a great beneficiary of the change in the world's understanding and appreciation and treatment of women. And, there are moments I would change, things everybody has something that she's done in her life that she would change, and moments where you lost your temper or something. But, as for big things, I have been very fortunate. I've had 2 fabulous husbands. My late husband, Floyd Haskell, who I was married to for 20 years and died. And my husband, David, who's vice chairman of surgery at Fairfax Hospital here, and who moved for me. He was chairman of surgery at Newton Wellesley when I met him. My mother sold him and his late wife their house. So I have been very fortunate in this life, and have had a wonderful family, and have been very lucky. So I don't really I think it would be looking a gift horse in the mouth to ask to change anything. Anybody else? Yes?
Although you're not a betting person, would you be willing to handicap the next retiring justice and when that might occur?
It's very difficult at this moment because you can't know who the next president's going to be. Unlike many people. I think this is about as close an election as I can imagine, probably since 2000. And I wouldn't handicap how it's going to turn out. So, you know, some older justices may retire at some point if either Barack Obama or Mitt Romney is president, who wouldn't retire if the other party were in power. So I think that is difficult to handicap, you know, barring some unforeseen health event. Justice Ginsburg, who's the oldest member of the court, I think she's 78, has said that she plans at least to stay on as long as the person whose seat she occupies, Brandeis, and I think he was like 83 or something. But, you know, but she's had 2 bouts with cancer. You just can never know when something like that happens. Anybody else? You're such a shy crowd. Yes.
The Supreme Court still offers the same balance in government that was set out to.
I'm sorry?
Do you think that the Supreme Court, given the litigiousness of our society and the path that cases take, still provides the same balance of government that it was set out to?
That the same balance of government that what?
That it was set out to in the Constitution as the 3 segments of government?
Well, I'm not sure it was set out to be a balance. It was set out to be an arbiter. And it's like the rest of the country. It's more polarized than at any time since I've covered the court. But elections do have consequences. And just as they're the kind of Republicans in Congress now are quite different than they were when I first came to Washington, the kinds of conservatives who serve on the court are quite different than the kinds of conservatives who served when I first started covering the court. And in fact, the liberals are different too. They're more conservative on the court. That's not true in Congress, but it is true on the court. Yes, you had a question, sir?
Along the same lines, so those of us who have worked around Congress for a long time, we've seen how the divergence in political positions has gone hand in hand with divergence in kind of personal relationships. You asked both the members here, I've heard from them before, that Republicans and Democrats don't have the same type of personal relationships which can help breed respect and exchange that they did 20, 30 years ago. Can you give an idea whether that's similar on the Supreme Court?
No, it's not. It's just not. They are, you know, I'm sure individuals like or dislike each other more or less and would not be likely to tell me if they really didn't like the Chief Justice, for example. But, you know, Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg are very close friends. I don't think this is not like Congress. They're not always out there on the hustings. They're not on television. They live together, and it's like a marriage, functional or dysfunctional. They're stuck for life there. And they're not, there have been times in the history of the court where it was, I think the famous quote is 9 scorpions in a bottle, and they really don't want to live that way. And so they're it's a much more formal atmosphere there too. Everything is done, almost everything is done in writing. They have their weekly conference where they, you know, do vote and discuss cases orally, but by and large, everything is done in writing. Every draft of every opinion, every line is, if you go and you look at the records that are now public of many of the justices, you see that there can be 7 or 8 drafts fighting over a single sentence, but it's all there, it's all in writing. Now, do people occasionally walk down the hall and have a conversation about, can we organize this better or whatever? But by and large, that's the way they do it. And it's a very different kind of institution. And the role of money plays no role at all. Far more important is sort of gastronomy and philosophy. That plays a huge role, but you don't have to worry about a campaign contribution. You're stuck, you gotta live on your salary. That's it, there's no other anything, you don't need somebody's money to, to keep your position. It's just very different. Yes?
What is, in your view, the most memorable story that you find?
The most memorable story? Well, I broke the Anita Hill story, so that's probably the most memorable. I don't know that it was the most important, but it is certainly the most memorable, especially when you get subpoenaed by the Senate and you have to fight it and all of that. I mean, that's certainly the most memorable, but I can never remember much beyond a week ago what I wrote. In fact, I have actually had the experience from, I go back and I look at some script that I wrote because I want to find out, remind myself what that case was about, and I not only don't remember writing what I wrote, I don't remember knowing what I wrote. But fortunately, I don't have to. I mean, I live a very daily deadline Dick existence, and what happened 3 weeks ago, it's great if I can remember it, but I don't have that kind of memory, and I used to feel terrible about it until I was covering one of the Iran-Contra trials, and Dan Webb was the prosecutor, and he did this very brilliant cross-examination of Ollie North, and he did not seem to have notes. He had, he just had a few things that he would pick out, exhibits, and it went on just like a rapid gunfire for hours. And I said to him, Dan, how do you do that? He said, well, I have a bathtub brain. I fill it up with water. I take the bath, and then I unplug the bathtub, and it all goes away. Well, that's sort of what I decided. I have a bathtub brain. Anybody else in the back?
Yes, I know you said that you don't like the handicap, but do you think the California gay marriage case will reach the court? And if so, would you venture a guess as to how it might be?
Well, I think it will reach the court. I think they would love to not have it reach them, and I suppose they could decide not to take it, but it only takes 4 votes to grant a case, so you don't need a majority to hear it, and it's been decided by the Ninth Circuit. Now, it could, they've asked for an en banc, meaning the full Ninth Circuit, it would be 11 judges would hear it, instead of a panel of 3. Well, that could delay it for another 8 months or so. But I don't see any way it doesn't get there, and unless there's sort of an active institutional decision to leave it for the time being, I don't see how it doesn't, I think it doesn't get decided. What's more likely to get there first is one of the DOMA cases, one of the Defense of Marriage Act cases. There's one in the First Circuit, and there's one in New York, which I think is the farthest along the way. Once that's decided, again, depending on whether or not there's an en banc, that heads right to the Supreme Court. And they can't not decide a DOMA case because that involves federal law. They can't just have it a million different ways. I suppose they could wait till they have a conflict between 2 courts, but those cases are coming, and I don't know how they will turn out, but my guess is that it will be a fairly closely divided court. DOMA might be different than marriage, because DOMA is simply recognizing a marriage, as opposed to recognizing it for purposes of federal law. I think in this case, the case that's in the Second Circuit is a woman whose wife died, and she will have to pay she'll have to pay $500,000 more in taxes if her marriage isn't recognized. So, and so the question will be whether that's unequal treatment under the 14th Amendment. Your guess is as good as mine. Okay, folks, I have to go back to Roger Clemens. Thank you.
Thank you all. You can see we now have two distinguished members of Congress here with us, so we're going to move ahead. Congressman Neal has joined us. Congressman Neal was, for those who don't know him so well, he comes from western and central Massachusetts, but he was elected in 1988. His excellence as a legislator earned him a position on the Powerful Ways and Means Committee, not something easy to come by. He has become one of the leading voices on economic policy for the House of Representatives, and we hope to see him as chairman of that committee someday. He continues to lead the way on difficult issues and was the lead sponsor of legislation to prevent American companies from moving offshore to avoid paying U.S. taxes, and continues his efforts to repeal the alternative minimum tax, which penalizes many middle-class Americans and which we fix every year. He has sponsored legislation that would increase the national savings rate, a passion I also share, by encouraging the use of individual retirement accounts. He's the co-chairman of the New England Congressional Caucus, where he's a forceful advocate for the unique regional interests of the 6 New England states, and he also serves as the chairman of the Friends of Ireland. He missed him, but we had the ambassador from Ireland to the United States earlier here today. So please join me in welcoming a congressman and a great friend, Richie Neal.
Thanks, Nikki, very much, and a warm welcome to all of you. I don't have to remind you what a terrific job that Nikki does every day representing your interest, particularly in the Merrimack Valley. John Olver's here, a friend of mine. Between the two of us, in terms of geography, I think at one time or another we've probably represented 3/4 of the state. I'm moving to 87 communities. I'm splitting part of John's old constituency in the redistricting process, and how grateful I am for the presence that he's had on the Appropriations Committee. Just a word that I know makes eyes glaze over, but it's still your committee assignment where you make your mark in the Congress. And we were always fortunate, from McCormick to O'Neill to Moakley, we all had great committee assignments. So that means you had John on the Appropriations Committee, Nikki on Armed Services, I'm on Ways and Means, Ed Markey is on Energy and Commerce, Barney made his way to the head of Financial Services, Steve Lynch, Mike Capuano, right down the line, and now with Bill Keating, because that's where you develop expertise. And I can't emphasize that enough, even though I know in this town that is now driven almost daily by conflict, that that's a missed point. If it becomes a missed point, it becomes a missed opportunity. So let me just briefly give you an idea of where I think we are, and then come back to the fundamental issue of tax reform. After the election, this is what we're going to be staring at. We're going to be staring at raising the debt ceiling again. I would submit this to you. The debt ceiling is an argument over paying your bills. It is not an argument over new spending. So, if you voted to go to war in Iraq, you need to vote to raise the debt ceiling, because that's where many of the costs are going to go for years to come. 1 million new veterans, cost of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan north of $3 trillion. If you're wounded in Iraq and you're 20 years old, or in Afghanistan, you're going to be in the care of the VA system for the next 50 to 60 years. That's not opinion, that's fact. Those are where the costs are going to accrue. In addition, we have to do the AMT patch at the end of the year. For many of you in the room, that R&D tax credit has to be reinstituted as part of the extenders package. The estate tax, if we do not address that, then that will revert to its previous standing. I call this to your attention because the Bush tax cuts expire. on January 1st, actually December 31st, but we still have the payroll tax issue that we have to address as well by the end of the year. My own take on the politics of this is that leverage moves to the president if he is reelected, and I'm also confident enough to suggest to you that it moves to him regardless of whether or not he's elected, only because on December 31st, he's still president. So that, I think, gives him some negotiating room. These issues are now right in the frying pan of debate here. Largely because I'm just going to make a couple of suggestions, and feel free during the questions that you might offer to challenge what I've said. Nothing got us into more trouble in this town than this argument that tax cuts pay for themselves. You can't find a mainstream economist in Washington that would make that argument. I regularly question, for the sake of the public record, Douglas Holtz-Aiken, who's a very capable guy. He was John McCain's top economic advisor and has advised Republican candidates for president, including Governor Romney. I will always ask him, Doug, do tax cuts pay for themselves? The answer, Mr. Neal, they do not pay for themselves. But that theology helped get us into the circumstance in which we find ourselves. In addition, you can't fight two wars with $2.3 trillion worth of tax cuts. Recall what it was like on January 19th of 2001. Trillions of dollars in surplus awaiting us as Bill Clinton said goodbye. 8 years later, debt upon debt upon debt. Distinguish between the term deficits and debt. Debt is accumulated deficits. So it's years of deficit spending. Also, it suggests this to you. Fact, not opinion. The money was borrowed to pay for the tax cuts. You ask, how could that have happened? It's very simple. If the revenue is not coming into the federal government, you have to borrow the money to pay for your obligations anyway. So that justified and allowed many of those tax cuts to occur. We've had a pretty ambitious trade agenda, as you know, and I know many of the companies that Nikki has in the Merrimack Valley and out through that area, that you're very interested in international trade measures. And we had a pretty, I thought, good year on the trade front. It seemed to find some bipartisan cooperation. The Ways and Means Committee does trade and tariffs, so I spend a lot of time on these issues, and I hear from people across the entire state. About 40% of the state's economy is trade-related, and we still have, I think, some opportunities now to deal with what is known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and developing relationships with what is now the emerging part of the world. If we were sitting in this room a decade ago and I said to you Brazil was going to be the 5th largest economy in the world, you would have thought there was something wrong with me. If I said to you that Peru and some of these smaller nations were going to be running trade surpluses, you would have said that's impossible. But all of that's happening on our watch. And another, but a more controversial item that will be before us is what to do as to whether or not allowing Russia to join WTO. That's a pretty significant issue that's sure to draw some fire here. I call these economic questions in front of you largely because a couple of very stubborn facts. If we could just get that unemployment rate down to the historic post-war norm of 4.5% to 5%, it takes care of almost 1/3 of the budget deficits. It's astounding. And why? Because cap gains go way up, income taxes go way up, and pressure on social spending goes way down. I would suggest this to you as well. Social Security has nothing to do with these budget deficits. That's a very separate issue. We're already raising the Social Security age limit by 1 month every year. So for me to draw the optimal benefit, I would be 66, for example. That's missed in this actuarial reality. Also, as it relates to payroll taxes, the other issue that has occurred during the recent 6 years, many people who lost their jobs at 62 began to draw down Social Security benefits. If you find yourself back at work, you can pay your Social Security benefits back and postpone retirement. A lot of people don't realize that. Medicare is a more difficult issue for all of us. But I know you have hospital representatives here, and the three of us, including the delegation, we have zealously guarded those hospitals. They give us our reputation. I always suggest to my friends from the Pacific Northwest, who will devote much of their economic argument to defending Boeing and to defending Microsoft, In Massachusetts, we have the best hospitals arguably in the world. Now, half their revenue comes from Medicare. Another 10 to 15% Medicaid. I have hospitals in Holyoke and in Springfield at the Sisters of Providence, north of 80% Medicare and Medicaid. We pay our doctors through their education opportunities with Medicare. It's called graduate medical education. And we insist that these hospitals take care of people, then we have to pay them correspondingly. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of what it is that I try to do every day here. The Ways and Means Committee, just so you know, it's a very small committee. There are only 41 of us, and it reflects probably closest to the proportions in the House of the two parties. And at the same time, it is, when I arrived at the committee, when Dan Rostenkowski was the chairman, there was a working partnership between Democrats and Republicans. That's pretty much gone. And it's because we deal with such incendiary issues of revenue and how to raise revenue. John has a bit more of a luxury because he's had the opportunity to figure out how to spend it. I have more of a challenge in trying to figure out how to raise it. But we both are graduates of the same school. If you vote to spend it, you need to vote to raise it. That's reality. So with that, I'd be happy to take a couple of questions that you might have. Or yes?
Talk about NAFTA and what it means to us now, and do you think it was a good idea?
Yeah, I think the jury's out on NAFTA. I was never sold on NAFTA. I think there were good trade agreements. There are not so good trade agreements, and there are trade agreements that have to be done. I would argue, no matter who likes the China Free Trade Agreement, PNTR with China, it had to be done. 95% of the consumer class in the world lives outside of the United States. The only part of the American economy last year that grew substantially, trade, 5.8%. I think the president is absolutely right when he says that doubling exports over the next 5 years is not only possible, but it provides new opportunities here for America. And I'm glad you raised that question, because while I was against NAFTA, and I think that, again, we have not been able to figure out whether it was good or not so good, there's another part of it that I think is very important. When I go